She is the nation's leading expert on the criminalization of pregnancy, and she joins me this morning to discuss her provocative new book, Policing the Womb: Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. UC Irvine professor Michael Goodwin joins me. Coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Dr. Michele Goodwin is an award-winning author, law professor, executive committee member of the ACLU, and tireless advocate and activist for reproductive justice. I'm so excited to have her joining me this morning to talk about her book, Policing the Womb, and really about the criminalization of motherhood. Good morning, and thank you for joining me, Professor Goodwin.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show. It's a real pleasure, and I so appreciate the work that you do.
Wow. And likewise, I am so excited about everything that you've been doing. I know I've watched you myself in the news, raising your voice on what's happening around this country after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But even before we get to that Dobbs decision and what the Supreme Court did this year in terms of gutting women's reproductive choices, your book is really about the, I use the word chilling, way in which women have become or are actually targets of secret state surveillance of their pregnancies. And this predates even the Roe v. Wade decision and definitely the overturning of it. Let's go back and just give us a sense of when this surveillance began and how it significantly impacts Black women.
It's a great question, and we could talk about it in the more immediate wave, and maybe I'll start there, because we could say that the surveillance, certainly of Black women's pregnancies, goes back to the foundations of American enslavement and the use of Black women's bodies for the procurement of capital. Black women's bodies became the subject of mortgage loans for white families who couldn't outright afford to purchase them, but instead engaged in mortgage lending, loan lending with banks. Many people don't know that there were mortgages on Black women's bodies, but let's talk about the more immediate.
I'm sorry, Professor Goodwin, I'm one of those people that didn't know that.
Yes, it's fascinating. You know, the industry of American mortgage loans, many people think about that as just with housing, but no, its early iterations were actually with Black people's bodies, taking out a mortgage when one couldn't afford outright to purchase a Black child or a Black woman.
So why Black families want to do this? Were they buying pregnant women to serve as slaves on their property?
Oh, sure. You know, the history is so sad and it's so shocking. And when you read the cases involving bankruptcies and wives suing their husbands because their husbands have bartered on the wives' property, which were Black women, and you read the cases and you see how courts would not even use, Black women weren't even deserving of their name being used, maybe their first name, and then their children were just counted, like number 1 through 4 and things like that. I mean, it's just monetizing Black women's bodies was just central to the foundations of American slavery and the origins of this country. Even life insurance itself, something that today people think of as a very responsible thing for families to do, and middle class and upper income families are very invested there, also working class families as well. But the way in which those industries built up were actually on life insurance policies of enslaved Black people. This idea that a dead, overworked Black woman will not produce any more wealth for a family. But if her body has been insured, then when she's been worked enough to death, then there can be further compensation off of her death. Those were the origins. I write about these in publications that are published with most recently with the Harvard Civil Liberties and Civil Rights Law Review, the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, et cetera. But, you know, these histories are well rooted in American case law as well. It's just unfortunate that there has been far too little study of those American archives, but they do exist. Mm-hmm. In the more recent iterations of these surveillance. One could say that we went from a period of human enslavement and the surveillance of Black women's bodies. Are they producing, after producing, all of that to sort of grow capital on plantations? We saw a period of time of surveilling Black women's bodies during the Jim Crow era, in a time in which has euphemistically been known as the Mississippi appendectomies, which were not appendectomies at all, but instead were the coercive sterilizations of Black women, and for that matter, indigenous women and women in Puerto Rico as well. And during this period of time, it wasn't just women, Black girls as young as 10, 11, 12 years old being coercively sterilized when their parents sought medical care for them. That's another form of surveillance. But then there's a third form of this surveillance, which has been racialized and connected with reproduction in the United States, and that's in the period of the U.S. war on drugs, which was a kind of failed effort that was selectively enforced, most notably against Black people and brown people, making significant exclusions when it came to white people, and things like making distinctions, false distinctions between powdered cocaine and crystallized cocaine, with disparate sentencing laws that were enacted through Congress, and then during the Obama administration, then many of those laws were revisited, and there was an acknowledgement of the kind of racialization of those laws. But during that period of the 1980s and 90s, not only was there this sense of the crack mom, and I put air quotes around that. It was a really horrific framing that later on the American Medical Association apologized for being complicit in. The New England Journal of Medicine said they would no longer use that kind of term of crack mom, of crack baby. At that same time, there was this welfare queen mythology, and all collected together meant the over-surveillance of Black women and their pregnancies, and to a horrific degree.
I'm so fascinated by that period. I mean, all of them are fascinating periods, but really that time period, the 70s, 80s, and this war on drugs that was happening in this country, and how this euphemistic term crack babies came into existence, and how racialized it was. And I know you write about it being not just racist, but fictional. Help us understand why even the concept of a quote unquote, as we say, crack baby was just a fiction.
It's heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. And that was the stereotyping and the stigmatization of Black women and their offspring. Doctors Claire Cole and Hallam Hurt had been doing what was really probably the most rigorous and robust research of maternal interfaces with various kinds of drugs, prescription medications, illicit medications, that is street drugs, as well as things like tobacco. Claire Cole, who is at Emory, and Dr. Hallam Hurt at Penn, these two women had spent decades of research studying what are the effects of alcohol on fetal development, what's the effects of tobacco on fetal development, what's the effects of powdered cocaine, crystallized cocaine, etc. And their research was saying something very different than what the New York Times was publishing, very different than what the Wall Street Journal was publishing, very different than what Rolling Stone was publishing. And they said, look, our research, we don't recommend that anybody takes crack during pregnancy at all. But this myth that's being curated here, that these children are the most dangerous to be born in the United States, that these children are born just trembling and that they don't appreciate eye contact, that they can't be held, all of this is just fictionalized. Dr. Claire Cole said that, look, when you see these news cameras in the hospital showing these shaking babies, those are not babies that were exposed to crystallized cocaine or crack. They are in the preemie ward, and that is what preemies do. Preemies shake. I have interviewed both of these doctors, and what they told me is that they were blacklisted. Eventually, journalists stopped interviewing them because they didn't have the story that
follow the narrative.
Right. I mean, they just weren't giving them this story of the horrific Black mom, the terrorizing Black child. And to just place in context what was being reported in major national news at the time was that these children would be uneducable, these children would be dangerous, these children would be the ones to cut up, blow up, gun up their school classrooms, that these were so stereotypic and horrific that these children had maldeformed brain development, that their genitalia was malformed, that their intestines malformed. None of this based on evidence.
Wow.
None of this based on science.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe, but we've lived through it, so we know it to be true. And I want to go from that horrific period in our country to this period where we saw the enactment of feticide laws. These laws, again, that were targeting women, particularly women of color, criminalizing pregnancies and motherhood. And now we come full circle looking at laws that are being enacted in places like Florida and Texas that are doing something very similar. But it didn't start in 2022. And I think that's what's so important for people to understand. This is not new, that this is a long history in this country.
That's right. What we see is something that's been more of a marathon than a sprint. We see the playbook already established, the groundwork already established, such that it becomes far easier for states to slip into these spaces because these were spaces in which they had already occupied. There was an expertise that was already developed in the profiling, the racialized profiling, and the kind of hunt for and against these kind of women. And the racial disparities have been quite glaring. During the 80s and 90s, a black woman was 10 times more likely than her white counterpart to have Child Protective Services called on her, reported on her by her medical providers, right? And so we're already seeing the sort of current times adapting from those prior times. And that's what's really important that we understand, that even though we're in a post-obs reality that denies reproductive freedom, such as the ability to be able to terminate a pregnancy, the reality is that these have times, all of this has been about policing control and power, overall power against women, whether women want to be pregnant, want to use contraception, or want to be able to terminate a pregnancy. There has been a policing, because much of that policing in the 80s and 90s involved women who wanted to be pregnant.
Yeah.
They weren't seeking abortions when they were being criminally punished.
In your book, Policing the Womb, it's important to note this book came out in 2020 before the Dobbs decision. But you didn't need the Dobbs decision to write about this continuum of policing of the womb, policing of motherhood that has occurred. And I'm so glad you just said something so important, because people often ask, people who profess to be pro-life, if it isn't just about their love and their concern about life, what is it? And you just nailed it by saying it's about power and control. And that message, I think we just got to keep beating that drum, because that's being evidenced by some of these cases, these recent cases. We've seen the case of the woman in Louisiana now who's being forced to carry a baby that they know, that the medical profession knows already has very serious medical issues, not likely to even survive a pregnancy, likely to be born, stillborn at birth. But yet this insistence and this refusal to allow her to terminate this pregnancy. Talk about what that means, and how do we get here, where literally you could be forced to carry a baby that the medical profession says is not going to survive.
That's right. So we're going to see forced pregnancies involving anencephalic fetuses. Those are fetuses without the development of the brain. Hydrocephalic, that's when there has been liquid or fluid on the brain. None of these, very often, a very high percentage, almost 100%, end in stillbirth or death within hours after birth. In this particular case in Louisiana, is a black woman being forced to remain pregnant in that state with a fetus that's developing without a skull. Yeah. There is a horror that is associated with the level of prurience that's here in the space. You began the program using the term chilling, and it absolutely is. It shows absolutely no rationality, but also shows no empathy either, no sense of care, no sense of compassion, but instead is something that is just so horrific in its desire to see people in pain and to see suffering. Now, some people might say, well, there's nothing intentional about this, which is the desire to see people in pain. But, there's something in the law that when there was such knowing recklessness,
right,
engaging in a particular practice, then we say you knew or you should have known about the kind of pain and suffering you were going to cause. And it's very clear in these cases that, yes, one should know the kind of pain and suffering that will be caused by forcing a 10-year-old to remain pregnant, forcing a woman who has a pregnancy such as the one we've been talking about to remain pregnant, forcing a woman to bleed more than 10 days, hemorrhaging until she's near death before her doctors may lawfully now intervene. All of that is a level of cruelty that is knowing.
Yeah, no doubt about it. The 10-year-old case also just so unbelievable that anyone would think it's a good idea for a 10-year-old to be forced to carry a pregnancy. And I'm thinking about another case you probably saw too, Professor Goodwin, where a court determined that a teenager was not mature enough to make a decision about an abortion. But the flip side of that is she is mature enough to carry a baby to term and then parent a child. I would say 18 years, but let's be clear, that's probably 30 years because kids don't leave home at 18. So the thinking that somehow you can be mature enough to be a parent in this country, but not to decide that you want to terminate a pregnancy. How can courts make those kinds of determinations? Is there any basis in the law?
Well, I'm glad that you raised this question about our courts. The book that I'm working on now addresses the historic complicity of the courts in the subordination of women, in the ways in which women have been denied constitutional protections. It's been our Supreme Court, it's been state courts that, let's be clear, denied women the right to vote, or upheld laws that denied women the right to vote, that upheld laws that denied women the ability to serve on juries, that upheld laws that denied women the opportunity to become lawyers and actually defend themselves and other women and their interests. The courts have held a pivotal role in the suppression of women's ability to be able to flourish. And I know that sounds big and like a lot, but let's keep in mind that as we think about the legacy of someone like Justice whether we're thinking about Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, or more specifically, I was thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Through the work that she did in the early part of her career, there were over 600 laws that her work in the ACLU contributed to in terms of striking down sex discriminatory laws. And just think about that. Hundreds of laws that denied women, in the face of the Constitution, equal opportunity, right? And when we think about a court doing this to a child,
right,
it's horrific, especially given what we've already been talking about, which is state surveillance. So a 16, 17-year-old being forced into a parenthood where she probably can't afford to take care of that child independently, at a time in which we don't expand Medicaid, at a time in which we're punishing towards women who are single and parents without providing adequate care for them, no state-funded child care, all of that puts her in a situation of being further surveilled and potentially criminally or civilly punished for not being perfect enough as a future mom.
Yeah, that's the irony of it. You force a teenager to have a baby and become a parent without the adequate resources, tools, and support, and then that teenager is likely to find herself the subject of, getting a knock on her door from the Department of Children's Services saying that she has done something, negligent, or she has been negligent in some way with respect to the care of that child. So now she and that child probably ends up in the system. And we know that kind of unending cycle that happens, particularly when you're talking about women of color. Professor Goodwin, your book, Policing the Womb, so important during this period, because when I look at what the next step is in this anti-abortion war that we're seeing played out after Dobbs, and as your book lays out, was happening even before Dobbs, this focus on fetuses and the personhood of fetuses. that seems to be the next horizon.
That's absolutely right.
Give fetuses personhood status. And then we know as lawyers what comes with that. If a fetus is a person, help us understand how that gets played out in our court systems.
Well, it's interesting because of the selective opportunism or interpretation and opportunism of fetuses having the status of constitutional persons, and who will that be enforced against, right? And so it is not as if constitutional personhood and fetuses will mean that fetuses are able to enter into contracts and other areas of the law that are really quite active, be able to own property or do the kinds of things that born people are able to do. But we will see how, and these laws are being shaped around, creating a conflict between the constitutional interest and rights of childbearing women, fetus-bearing women, and then the fetuses that they are bearing. This idea that has been articulated by some legislators, which is that a fetus or an embryo has the same constitutional standing and rights as a woman does. And that's very dangerous thinking. It's incredibly dangerous thinking. It's something that probably would not be entertained against a man, that an embryo has the same constitutional personhood as a man does. The idea of it seems...
And let's just give some vivid examples, because I don't think people, again, can really grasp what that means. I'm even thinking about, does that fetus have to have a lawyer assigned to it? You know, if there is some conflict,
well, let's talk about that. You know, as we were talking about before, this immediate wave before now in the 80s and 90s with the attacks on Black women and their pregnancies and the stereotypes and stigmatizations, the kind of selective punishment and prosecution and surveillance. In Wisconsin and a few other states, they passed these laws, euphemistically called crack baby mamas laws, which provided for the civil incarceration of women, pregnant women, for the protection of their fetuses, meaning that we won't send you to jail, but we think that you are dangerous enough to the development of your fetus that we will civilly confine you. And it is unknown exactly how many, but this has been triggered in hundreds of cases, it is known. And in the more recent iterations of this, where it has crossed the racial barrier, where white women have been affected, then we know in recent cases there have been women denied attorneys, but their fetuses in the state of Wisconsin have been provided attorneys. So you are absolutely right. Fetal representation of lawyers, where women cannot even get representation by the state, and states are not obligated to provide legal representation in civil matters, in most civil matters.
You know, what's so, again, hypocritical about this whole effort to give personhood status to a fetus is we don't see the same kind of recognition of personhood and the prominence and importance of personhood when you think about Black people living in poverty, living in toxic environments. Help us understand, again, just the deep level of hypocrisy that we're talking about. There's this deep concern for a fetus, but yet born, as you call it, born persons, the 5-year-old, the 6-year-old that's living next to the dump site, the toxic dump site, the 5 or 6-year-old that can't get access to health care. We don't see the same outpouring of support from many of these legislators, particularly those in the South.
That's absolutely right, and that's the real tragedy that's associated, a kind of intergenerational, cross-centuries hypocrisy in these spaces. That is to say that Black life, it's been really hard to track when Black life has truly mattered. And again, I'm not speaking in hyperbole, but challenging all of those who are listening to think critically about where we are in our nation. The first iterations that Black people have the status of 3/5 of a person, not even full personhood at all. just a period less than 20 years out of slavery, we have the Supreme Court in a case called the Civil Rights Cases, ironically enough. We have the Supreme Court saying that Black people have been too favored in the United States and that it's time now for Black people to become mere citizens. Are you kidding me? Too favored in a country of lynchings, enslavement, kidnapping.
What year is that case, Professor Goodwin?
Around 1883.
1883, okay. So
this is pre-Plessy v. Ferguson.
Okay.
And then we see the separate but equal laws in the United States that were not just defined around Rosa Parks and her courage and refusing to give up her bus seat, which we know she was a real activist on women's issues as well and so much more, and she's been kind of framed as just about the bus. But we know that separate but equal affected schooling, housing, recreation, Black people not even being able to go to parks and swimming pools, all of that stuff, right? So when you ask this question about, well, where is Black personhood? It turns out that with the exception of federal intervention and Supreme Court intervention, we're not well practiced, especially in states like Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Georgia, of affirming Black life. Right? I mean, with the exceptions of the federal government having to come in and say, stop bombing Black homes in Alabama.
Right.
Mississippi, stop lynching Black people and now Jewish people after the young civil rights leaders or, young folks came down, Mickey Schwerner, Andy Goodman, et cetera, went down to Mississippi to help Black people register to vote and ended up dead, right? Federal government coming in and saying, let's investigate. It's been a tragic history in our country to make real the promise of the Constitution and constitutional personhood of Black people having meaning in those very same states that now have enacted anti-abortion measures.
Yeah, your book, Policing the Womb, again, so comprehensive in addressing this kind of continuum of assault that has taken place against women, particularly women of color. What is if you had to give one or two top line takeaways that you would want readers to leave your book with, what would they be?
I would say understanding the way in which power works in our country and the way in which power has been wielded against women's ability to be able to flourish as full constitutional citizens, and that we're still on that arc towards justice in that regard, that we're even having this very important conversation in 2022 says so much about the long road to go towards full equality and freedom for women in this country. And that it's important that we not just isolate abortion in this context, but that we're talking about every aspect of the reproductive health line when we are talking about reproductive justice and reproductive rights and reproductive health. We have to understand that at the same time, while there are anti-abortion measures that are now being enforced in the states we've talked about, they're also denying sex education. They're also enforcing abstinence only when there is some form of sex education. By the closure of clinics that provided abortion care, this means that contraceptive access has also become incredibly vulnerable in those same places, because the places that provided abortion were also the places that also provided access to contraception, STD screenings, and so much more. And so we have to thread the needle in really comprehensive ways. And the final thing that I would say is this, is that one doesn't have to personally support abortion rights. One can make those personal decisions on their own. But there is something that is grievously wrong, egregiously wrong, to suggest that a 9 or 10-year-old girl must suffer through a pregnancy, and if she survives it at all, and then parenthood simply because one's own personal and even personal religious views might impose certain obstacles for themselves personally. The Constitution does not provide us a right to be able to harm other people based on our religious or ideological views. The Constitution stops at that.
And that was going to be my last question for you, is those folks that come at this from their personal religious conviction and try to shame others and to suggest that others who support women's reproductive freedoms and choices are somehow anti-children, anti-babies, baby killers. We've heard all of these pejorative terms used to describe those that believe in choice, those that believe that the Constitution does prevent one person from harming another person. What's the best argument? Because we are all finding ourselves in these conversations, whether it's at the dinner table, a party, someplace, the conversation comes up about Roe v. Wade, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, women's reproductive choices. And when you're talking to that person who is such a religious zealot and believes that they are so right about this and are, so adamant that if you support choice, you are a baby killer. Give us like the killer response to them. So I want to say it loud over and over again I'm thinking of some people I want to share this with.
Well, here's what I would say, and then this for me happens to be the part of the many important arguments, is that a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. And in Mississippi, a Black woman is 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by being able to terminate that pregnancy. It comes down to whether we even value or care about the lives of women in this country. And for Black women, if you're at the table with Black folks, if you can't care about the life of a Black woman in this country, how can you respect yourself?
Yeah. Well said, well put. And I'm thinking of some Black women that need to hear this, because it's not just white women we know who are adamant about denying women their reproductive choices, not just white men. There are many in the African American community as well who often espouse some of these same principles and beliefs that somehow, and the Black church in particular has been really conflicted. I said that was my last question, but now you maybe I'm thinking of something else. The Black church has been so conflicted on this issue of women's reproductive choices and how they take a position around abortion and abortion care. And I'm sure you've experienced that as a Black woman, as a professor. I don't know what your religious beliefs are, but you can't probably be Black and not know someone that is affiliated with a denomination or church that has, for decades, if not centuries, really shamed women who would exercise choice.
Well, shamed women for any number of things. Shamed women for wearing red lipstick. Shamed women for wearing high-heel pumps, right? So that we need to do another show on that, right? The sort of
I want to have you back. I want to talk about that because that is so interesting, because we're in this moment where that is such a big issue. But again, I want to thank you. Your book, Policing the Womb, such an important book, came out before Dobbs, but it's as if you knew Dobbs was coming. So you were already where we needed to be. You got us prepared for it, and I can't wait to see what read your new book. When is it coming out? You mentioned a new book about the court system.
Well, hopefully we might be able to get it out by the end of next year, if not before. So fingers crossed.
Yes. Well, good luck. We'll definitely continue this conversation. I definitely want to have that conversation about the Black church and issues of women, Black women in particular, reproductive freedoms. Thank you again, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Being such an incredible advocate on this issue. We need your voice. I want to thank Professor Michele Goodwin for joining me this morning and really helping us understand this journey. And the journey began for women long before the Roe v. Wade decision came down by the Supreme Court in the 70s, and definitely before the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe just this year. Michele Goodwin's book gives us a timeline of the chilling, and I keep using that word because it's so important for us, I think, to recognize what the history of women, our pregnancies, and motherhood has been like in this country. It is not a pretty picture. And if some of these zealots who are in state legislatures, zealots who are on our Supreme Court, those that are in our U.S. Congress and our Senate, if they have their way, the criminalization of women's pregnancies and motherhood will only continue. And it can get worse. It definitely can get worse. which leads me to my words to live by. Your personal beliefs are not a license for you to do harm to others. Professor Goodwin said that so eloquently when she said the Constitution doesn't give you the right, because of your personal religious beliefs, to do harm to others, particularly Black women. And when you hear those stats, 14 times more likely to die in pregnancy, 118 more times likely to die in pregnancy in states like Mississippi, that should give everyone pause before they are so quick to condemn those like me who believe in women's reproductive choices and freedom. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.